What I'd like to do today is to say a few things about the genesis of the project, some things that I learned along the way, especially things that I learned here in the Cornell community, and then to maybe motivate some of the questions that the book tries to answer by looking at some examples of how we continually desire to hear the world around us, even faced with the impossibility of ever hearing what the music of the spheres might sound like. Why do we care at all? Why has this been such a perennial question? But before we get to the local context, this of course is Carl Sagan, I just want to say a few things about how this project arose. As with many assistant professors who are gunning for tenure, by necessity, this arose not from a brand new project that I started when I arrived, but from a project that had a long gestation period leading to a kind of midway point, perhaps, which was the doctoral dissertation that I completed at the University of Toronto in 2011. But when I arrived here in conversation with a colleague, a junior faculty colleague, also in the music department, who was likewise working on his book project, we were having lunch up in Trillium and talking about sort of almost sometimes the feeling of impossibility as we embark upon trying to write a book, something neither of us had done before. And he offered a nugget of wisdom, kind of gnomic wisdom, that he had received from his advisor. And we talked about what it might mean, but it actually ended up being pretty important for my own writing process. And the little bit of gnomic advice was something like this. Don't write the only book you can write, but write a book that only you can write. I think it sounds like it means more than it does. Perhaps that's the case. But I think the first part is a lesson that the book should not be coextensive with everything that you have to say on a subject. If there's nothing outside of the book that you could possibly say, then you need to think more so that you have more selections or passages and ideas to select from and to construct an argument. There needs to always be more. You can never be forced to write it because it's the only thing you have to say. But more importantly is the idea of writing a book that only you can write, which sounds a bit hubristic, but I think it is important because the pressures in the book writing process, coming from both the politics of the academic world that we are all engaged with, the peer review process, the ways in which so many voices find their way into your text. It's sometimes easy to start writing for ideal readers, to start writing for ideal press readers, to start writing for ideal tenure committee readers, and to lose your own voice in that process. And so always keeping in mind, and this is true for even the smallest of seminar papers, always keeping in mind what it is that your perspective and your vantage point can bring to a topic, and to not shy away from those moments of personal, sometimes very subjective intervention. Now, how this came to be a book that only I could write was largely the accidental and somewhat serendipitous process of my own educational trajectory through higher ed, which began with an undergraduate degree at Truman State University of piano performance. I wouldn't recommend anyone do a piano performance degree at a small northern Missouri state school. It's not worth a lot, but it did give me the opportunity to do a lot of other things along the way, including a minor in classics with Greek and Latin. And it was that then when I showed up at the Eastman School of Music, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed to do some work in musicology. It was going to be a PhD in musicology. The historian of theory, Gabriella Curry, immediately said, oh, you know Greek and Latin, you have to come take my history of theory course. And that was the only reason I showed up for that history of theory course. I wanted to do musical modernism. I had plans, and they weren't medieval music theory. But as you know, you can already see the punchline, that turned out to be exactly what I needed at that moment. And I ended up really thinking more about the importance of music theory and the history of music theoretical ideas as they applied in some of the domains that I was, in a way, more engaged with, philosophical ideas, cosmological ideas. And the process became, for seminar paper after seminar paper, of looking for music theory in all the wrong places, trying to find how patterns of thought that we don't immediately think of as musical are somehow driven by, governed by, thought through with concepts that were musical. And that led me to a dissertation which was vaguely formulated at the Eastman School of Music of something like music theory and non-music theoretical texts. That was the big idea, and it ended up honing in on some 12th century philosophy as the way to do this. And as I began to work on that dissertation after completing the doctoral exams and the prospectus, I realized, as many PhD students do, that I didn't know anything about what I actually wanted to write about. And so instead of doing what I always encourage my graduate students to do, which is to continue thinking and push and really it's there, I just left and went and did another degree so I could learn about the things that I didn't know that, or I knew that I didn't know about. So I ended up leaving Eastman and going to study Latin philosophy, codicology, text editing, etc. at the University of Toronto. And that gave me, it really did give me the tools that I needed to do a careful study of the sources, to gain access to materials in archives that were not translated, that were not in readily available critical editions, and to expand the wealth of evidence that was available to me to make the argument. Then it also gave me the chance to have some really top-notch interlocutors in medieval philosophy, particularly the Father Edward Journoud, who was one of the great historians, still is, quite aged, but still is one of the great historians of 12th century philosophy, and learned from him and spent a lot of time with him in Toronto. And it was these accidental kind of serendipitous occurrences that led me to be able to write a book like Composing the World, Harmony in the Medieval Platonic Cosmos, which tries to marshal all of these different perspectives and to, in a way, correct the record, as I sometimes thought about it, as to what constitutes musical harmony within these philosophical and cosmological contexts, but also to think about the very nitty-gritty technical philosophical ideas and music theoretical ideas that sometimes philosophers couldn't handle on the music side or music theorists couldn't handle on the philosophy side, and to try to bring them together and to speak to a much wider audience. Sometimes it's easier to sharpen your arguments if you have a target at which to point, and the target was, in a way, some of these grand syntheses that tried to say big ideas about what the harmony of the spheres were, or sometimes minute studies that gave you all sorts of particulars but never tried to pull out to the big question, the catechistic question, and what does this mean? So it tries to both dig into the particulars in a very careful, philologically grounded way, but also to pull out and to think about what does this mean. That's sort of where the project came from. And what it takes as both its starting point, but also the target sometimes of some of its more pointed arguments, is an idea that has been long thought to drive the whole notion of cosmic harmony. And that's an idea as articulated here by Carl Sagan in a book from 1978, I think it was. It was just after the Golden Record in 77, a book in 1978 or 79, I'll have to check the date on that, called Murmurs of Earth, which was a record, a account of a record. It was an account of the Golden Record that Carl Sagan, Frank Drake, Timothy Ferris, Linda Sagan, and Druyan, am I pronouncing that last name? Anyone? Yeah? Druyan put together, which were included on the Voyager expeditions, which launched in August 20th and September 5th, 1977. So this is the 40th anniversary of those golden records, and for those of you who are interested, there actually will be a celebration of them, including visits from Frank Drake and others who were involved in the project, and Druyan is going to be in town bringing with her one of 3 extant copies of the cover of the record. There were only 2 records pressed. They are now in or one of them's in interstellar space, the other one's almost there. But there were 5 covers made, 3 of them still here on Earth. The one that Anne has actually never left her possession. And so it's really quite a treat for us to have it here. Anyway, so Carl Sagan, in thinking about the process and why this golden record, which included 27 musical examples, the first one being one of Bach's Brandenburg Concerti. Anyway, we're not going to go into the contents of the record now, but he tried in his Murmurs of Earth to give an account as to why music might matter on these Voyager explorations in a way that went beyond just a snapshot of aesthetic preference amongst human listening practices here on Earth. And he makes the claim, which will sound familiar for any of you who have thought about Pythagoreanism, who have thought about Neoplatonism, who have thought about Hermetic texts, who have thought about any kind of broad philosophical notion of what makes the world turn. And he says the connection between music and mathematics has been marked at least since the time of Pythagoras. But so far as we can tell, mathematical relationships should be valid for all planets, biologies, cultures, and philosophies. Perhaps there is a universal music. In this question, perhaps there is a universal music, in the sense that music might become a kind of key to all mythologies, a kind of root science for making claims about all sorts of phenomena, has been a perennial question for many in the fields, historical fields of natural philosophy, physica, which became physics in our modern sense, but also cosmology, the idea of how the world came to be and how it's sustained as a system. Now, included on this golden record, and this is one of the, I think, a wonderful kind of meta moment, is some recordings of soundscapes here on Earth, which include things like the sound of thunder, the sound of a volcano, the sound of horse beats, the sound of a heartbeat, the sound of all sorts of baby crying, a kiss, which was Anne kissing Timothy Ferris's cheek in the studio in CBS, etc. But included, the first of these soundscapes of Earth was in fact the only work, musical work, we could say, that was composed by a woman on the record, and one of only 2 living composers whose works were included on the record, the other living composer being Chuck Berry. Steve Martin has the famous quip that, you know, if we ever get a note from aliens, it'll say, send more Chuck Berry. Anyway, so Laurie Spiegel's Music of the Spheres was sent, it was actually composed not in 1977, but sometime earlier in the 70s. And what it is it's a inputting into an early synthesizer. She worked at the Bell Laboratories in conjunction with some Yale professors, computer science professors and musicians as well. She inputted the data from Kepler's 1617 Harmonices Mundi, or the Harmonicae Mundi, the harmony of the world. The data that Kepler had determined in order to prove that the orbital periods of the planets are proportional in some fundamental way that we're not going to get into now. Now, Kepler never realizes this sonically. But what Laurie Spiegel and her colleagues did was plug this into one of the early computer synthesizers and generated the sound of the music of the spheres, which is 10 minutes of sound which amount to 100 years worth of the orbital periods of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And it sounds like this. It sounds like, let's try this again. Sounds like this. Anyway, so you get the idea. It continues for 10 minutes worth of these sounds. And I love the fact that the music of the spheres is currently, or at least Kepler's version of it as realized in Bell Laboratories, is currently in interstellar space, maybe where it belongs. But this idea that somehow systems of planetary systems, universal systems, contain some sort of musical law that holds them in balance was recently, and this is May 10th, 2017, so this came after, I didn't talk about it in the book, it came after the book came out, but TRAPPIST-1, a solar system that's 37.5 light years away from the sun, that is in the constellation Aquarius, has been discovered as the closest analog, known analog to to our solar system, and thus the best potential for perhaps finding extraterrestrial life, because the planets are about Earth-sized. They orbit a white dwarf, so a much older, colder star, but because of that, they have much tighter orbits. The orbital periods of these 7 planets range from like 1.7 days to 18.5 days or something like that. It's all in the article, which I just read. I don't usually know these things. But what the argument that's made then is computer modelings of this tightly packed solar system could not account for how it maintained its balance, why these planets moving so fast and so tightly around this small dwarf star didn't just spin off into outer space. And the proof that was given through computer modeling is that the orbital periods of the planets, in fact, demonstrate harmonic resonance, that their orbital periods are in harmony to one another in much the same way that Kepler had claimed, though the math is different for ours. And this too was immediately, by a musician and scientist in the office next to the guy who made this mathematical discovery, was immediately put to music as well. So you can look on YouTube and find this, which is the harmony of TRAPPIST-1. Each one of these being orbital periods. I think that's fantastic. And somehow that's supposed to, I mean, in a way, our aesthetic desire for that object increases our curiosity, our sense of wonder at that universal system itself. And so now I want to pull to one last example, which is the example that I start with in the book, and that's the example of gravitational waves, which had just been confirmed in a February 2016 press release, or press conference, excuse me, that the LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravity Observatory, had detected the authenticated and absolutely proven presence of a gravitational wave. And this made headlines, of course, across the world, and it crossed my desk via a YouTube video after the book had already been sent to the press, or at least the first version. But I discovered this. It turned out to be the most expensive YouTube video I've ever seen because of licensing clips or licensing costs in order to include text from it in my book. I can't tell you how much it cost because there's a gag order because it's a non-precedential rate. Anyway, they made it affordable, but here's a meeting between Brian Greene and Stephen Colbert on The Colbert Show that I think really comes to and puts a finger on why hearing the world matters so much.
Well, what can we do this now?
All right, so with Colbert behind me, I'd like to do just a quick read of what I have to say about that exchange, only because I think I said it better than I could say it now, and it was a kind of fit of inspiration after seeing that video and realizing how it fits. So here's what I say. I want to highlight 3 aspects of this exchange that are directly related to themes and arguments developed in this book. First, the human ability to hear the cosmos is always predicated on the transduction, the movement across of an extrasonic signal, a signal that always exceeds or outstrips the physical embodied limitations of the ear into a sonic representation accommodated to human sensory realities. In fact, all of the examples we've seen have been some sort of taking of a signal and turning it into sound. As Green notes, we can only, in some sense, hear gravitational waves, only to the extent that the signal is transmitted via the medium of gravity is transduced into a sonic signal that the ears can register. Put another way, only Pythagoras could hear the music of the spheres. And as Isaac Newton is reported to have claimed, I thought Pythagoras' music of the spheres was intended to typify gravity. Second, these sounds are spectacular and herald a revolution in our understanding of the universe. The importance of these sounds is epistemological. They, or the sounds qua spectacular in the etymological sense of a spectaculum as an act of seeing, allow us insight into unseen and invisible forces of nature. As transduced sonic objects, they encode information about their sound producers. They, quote, tell us things about the universe that we have no other way of discerning. Put another way, to hear the cosmos is to experience the world through a cosmic acoustomology, which is a fancy word for acoustic epistemology, a way of knowing the world through sounds, that privileges the experience of sound as a special kind of relational knowledge, a knowing with and knowing through what is audible. Third, as the comedic force of Colbert's memorable punchline, "Is God Bugs Bunny?" suggests, there is a fundamental disjunction between sound and source. The original sonic transduction at the time of this writing, and this is no longer true, there's been more than one, only gravitational wave recorded, evokes the thump of a sampled bass drum, while a frequency-adjusted version shifted by 400 hertz to accommodate human hearing sounds more akin to the drip of a leaky faucet in the dead of night. The still more cleaned-up simulation that was played on The Late Show, which optimizes the signal-to-noise ratio, sounds even more disconnected. Its blippy, sliding chirp, profoundly disproportionate to the gravity of its source. Less an awe-inspiring black hole collision-worthy sound, and more a Bugs Bunny slapstick boing. Just as extrasonic cosmic signals always outstrip our ability to hear them, so too our desire to actually hear such sounds always outstrips the monumentality of their sonic transduction. Put another way, the sounds of the cosmos are more likely to present themselves to the ping of hammers in a humble blacksmith's forge, which is the famous origin myth of where music theory came about, Pythagoras' discovery of music theory, than as the thunderous, unmediated sound of a divine maker. And those are the points that I think we can still take away from thinking through contemporary cosmic ideas of what the harmonious might be. And the 4 big, when I put them on the slide, I realized only then, really wordy claims that I enumerate in the book, there are these 4, that the harmony is grounded in material interactions and intermaterial relations, that harmony can be the optimistic site, sorry, that's a typo, of a unified theory of cosmology, which can account for the many resonances between macrocosm and microcosm, soul and body, immaterial and material worlds, even between God and humanity, not humanities, but I kind of like that. That harmony serves not just as the foregrounded subject of discourse about the world, but even as the unarticulated ground for thinking and theorizing the world at all. And finally, that the aesthetic and effective power of phenomenal harmony as sound can be deliberately and consciously exploited to explain and instill a sense of cosmic affect, the sense of wonder, love, and desire to hear the harmony of the world. And I follow these claims and take them through five, we'll look at the table of contents in a moment, but through 5 chapters, 5 core chapters that try to set up what it means to hear the world. The second, which tries to set up what it means to compose the world through texts, so divisions of knowledge and where music fits into that. And then in the next 3 core chapters, I move through ideas of harmony within the microcosm, the human body, then to ideas of music or ideas of harmony within sounding music, what was called at that time, based on terminology from the 6th century by Boethius, musica instrumentalis, or it sounds like instrumental music, but includes the human voice as well. And then the final chapter moves to the most famous example, cosmic harmony, musica mundana, which includes not just the sound of the spheres that we've been talking about, but also the sound of the harmonies that hold the seasons together, as well as the harmony that holds the elements that put the world together in the first place. And those are the 5 big areas that I talk through. But what I'd like to do for the rest of this talk today is to focus on 3 little words from a 12th century philosopher. And really it's the 12th century that I spend the most time with, and we could talk more about that and why, maybe on the questions. But I want to focus on these 3 little words, mundus diligit concordiam, and to try to unpack some of the themes that I use this phrase to highlight some of the points that the book makes. I was very pleased that in the first review of the book, the reviewer said that I made good use of the famous phrase by William of Conches, "The world loves harmony." And I'm delighted he thinks it's famous, because I don't think anyone had ever talked about it before. So I made a case for why we should care. But mundus diligit concordiam translates as "the world loves harmony." And so what I do in the beginning of the book is sort of think through each one of these words, which are kind of worlds in and of themselves. And I start with the fact that mundus is in the subject position. That is to say that mundus is the subject of an active verb. The world is doing something. We could rephrase this and say something like, the world has harmony, or the world is harmony, or the world is harmonized. Like, there are all sorts of ways of formulating the same idea without making the world the subject of an active verb that somehow has efficacy or some kind of agency in the world. And so agency, the question of where this harmony comes from, the fact that William of Conches could claim the world loves harmony, means that there's something autonomous about this harmony. That it's not been imposed from without, but it's something that the world is actively seeking. And it becomes a kind of self-sustaining autonomy, because as we're going to find out, the world, because it loves harmony, is harmonious. And so it becomes this kind of cyclical movement of a self-sustaining autonomous world order. In that sense, it's very different than ideas of cosmic harmony as love that had been long been bandied about, and especially in the Latin poetic tradition. This is Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, the statesman and intellectual from the 6th century, writing in a book that he wrote just before his tragic death at the hands of Theodoric. He writes, "What binds all things in order, governing earth, sea, and sky, is love. Oh, happy would be the human race if the love that rules the heavens would also rule in your hearts." And this poem that he includes in this argument, or in his book, ends up being the kind of linchpin in a broader argument that says, Boethius, the character in the novel, says, look, the world is in disarray, there are tyrants, I am subject to the will of a tyrant who is out to kill me. You say that there's harmony, I say not as I live the world. And so there's a kind of disjunct Boethius thinks in the world. There is the lived experience of human tyranny, and then there is the harmony that exists in the kind of divine realm of perfection. Would that the love that rules the heavens also rule in your hearts? But it ends up being a kind of, the reply to this argument is, oh, you've got it wrong. In fact, everything is bound by this same harmony. You just can't see it. And that's the bitter pill. That's the consolation that philosophy offers. It's kind of cold consolation. He still dies. But this really is a kind of static, divine harmony that is imposed upon a set of particulars that appear to be cacophonous. But that's very different than this idea of the world loves concord that William gives us, where it's not a divine harmony that's coming from without, but in fact it's a world exercising its own kind of agency, seeking its own harmony. So that's the first thing, is the question of agency and the idea that harmony on all sorts of levels, macrocosm and microcosm, can be a kind of self-sustaining order. The second then is, why does he say love? Why claim that there is a love relation between world and harmony? And this gets me to the question of affect, that these harmonies somehow instill a kind of desire that, for lack of a better term, we often, the philosophers I look at and even contemporary thinkers sometimes describe as a kind of love or desire affect for order. So if you want to think well, I'll hold off on that. So this world-loving concord gets me to the idea that somehow we can marshal the affective experience or the affective desires of individuals who live within this world to, in fact, try to seek the principles of its own system. And then the last thing is the problem then with concordia. So if we have agency, we have an affect that is desiring that agency. If the world loves concord, then there's always lurking behind concord the fact that if discord should ever creep in, the whole shebang would fall apart. And that's exactly how this sentence continues. The world loves concord, and if the elements were ever to become discordant, even the world would dissolve. So behind concord, there's this continual threat that somehow it might be undone, things might be unbound, and the world would fall apart. So there's a vulnerability that is built into the very thing that we desire in our own kind of, or even the world's own agency in trying to maintain its own order. Now, as I point out in the book, from the standpoint of the macrocosm, the whole universe, there are two promises that sort of assuage our worries. The first is that Plato in his Timaeus, which is an account of the creation of the world by a cool little maker called the Demiurge. The Demiurge puts it together and then says, and by the way, just in case you're worried, these bonds, which are harmonies, these bonds cannot be taken apart except by the one who put them together. So we're assured that the world will not be undone unless the Demiurge or the one behind the Demiurge decides that it's time to call the experiment to an end. Also, we have the biblical example for this would be the Noahic covenant that's given after the floodwaters have, or while they're receding, the fact that there's the promise that the world will never again see a flood like this. Right? So there are promises in the Bible, there are promises in philosophical texts that say, look, the macrocosm is safe. Things aren't going to be undone. But the problem is the microcosm, the human soul, and the relationship between the human soul and the body is always under threat. Like, we all know that we can be bad people. We all know that bad things happen to good people. We all know that somehow that fragile bond between soul and body can be broken. So while there are promises made for the macrocosm, the vulnerability is all too real a threat for the microcosm. And that's one reason to think so carefully about what the sustaining power of the macrocosm can tell us about ordering our own lives in order to ensure that the worst doesn't befall us. Now, this too is Boethian. So from that same poem, if love's reins slackened, all things now held by mutual love would at once fall to warring with each other, striving to wreck that engine, that machina of the world, which now they drive in mutual trust with motion beautiful. So I trace this idea of the vulnerability of the cosmos through especially into the problem of disharmony within the soul and how that can be rectified through proper knowledge of harmonic rules in the world of sounding music, as well as looking up to the heavens and trying to figure out that perpetual motion beautiful that maintains the harmony of the heavens, which we know will not be undone. But the last thing I want to do today is to think one more time and to pull out to the modern world and to motivate this question again with an example that I think is just fantastic, and it highlights just how deeply these ideas are embedded in the ways that we talk about and think about even the most mundane of phenomenon. So what you're looking at here is a illustration for a Swedish newspaper in 1984 of a work from 1922 by Louis Fry Richardson. That work, we'll come back to this, is Weather Prediction by Numerical Process. And so this was an article in a Swedish newspaper about supercomputers computing the weather. And so they went back and went back to this text, which we'll talk about in a second. And this guy, Alf Lannerback, who was a Swedish freelance illustrator, best known for his dog training manuals and his work with the Swedish Army. And just as an aside, it's his brother, Leonard Lannerback, who finally gave me the permission. There's a great story about how I got the permission. But Leonard Lannerback's son is Yngve Malmsteen. Anyone, does that name ring a bell? So one of the greatest Swedish kind of shredder guitarists, now living in Florida, is the nephew of the guy who did this. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But this painting, or this engraving, this illumination from or illustration from the Swedish newspaper, what it illustrates is this passage from Louis Fry Richardson's Weather Prediction by Numerical Process. And it reads as follows: after so much hard reasoning, may one play with a fantasy. What he's doing here is trying to figure out how you could, by brute calculation force, and not by argument from analogy or looking at patterns, actually calculate the weather for a given day. That's what he's trying to do. And he, in fact, tried to do that for like May 10th, 1910. You can read about it on Wikipedia, which is where I read about it. After so much hard reasoning, may one play with a fantasy. Imagine a large hall like a theater, except that the circles and galleries go right round the space usually occupied by a stage. The walls of this chamber are painted to form a map of the globe. A myriad computers, and by computers he actually means people who are sitting there with slide rules computing, not computers, are at work on the weather of the part of the map where each sits, but each computer attends only to one equation or part of an equation. From the floor of a pit, a tall pillar rises to half the height of the hall. It carries a large pulpit on its top. In this sits the man in charge of the whole theater. He is surrounded by several assistants and messengers. One of his duties is to maintain a uniform speed of progress in all parts of the globe. In this respect, he is like the conductor of an orchestra, in which the instruments are slide rules and calculating machines. And what's so striking to me about this passage and even the illumination itself are the mixed metaphors that combine to form this world engineering machine. It is both a theater on which the stage of fate unfolds. It is a church because it is a pulpit, but it is also an orchestra where the conductor is orchestrating all of these parts in order to make it a weather calculating machine. And in fact, that's what lots of historians of weather forecasting, there's a surprisingly large amount of scholarship on the history of weather forecasting, but they've really pointed to this as an example of kind of the early thought experiment of a modern massively parallel processor, because there's more than just this. There's the place where you go store all the data, and he actually describes something that's like a CPU with a front side bus going to memory storage. It really is a kind of computer architecture that he's describing. But what fascinates me are the terms that he uses to describe this seemingly prescient and modern thing are in fact quite old and have quite a complicated history that the book tries to unfold. And that what I suggest is something like this image here, sorry, there it is. It's a big image, so it's not wanting to go. Yeah, there we go. This image here, which in fact had an associated, there was a mnemonic for it, for what he was doing. It was bigger worlds feed little worlds, or no, bigger worlds make smaller worlds that feed upon their velocity, and lesser worlds make little worlds, and so on to viscosity. Something like that. So what he's really talking about, what he's calculating here, is turbulence, is winds. And so I suggest that maybe we not think about this in terms of a modern, massively parallel processor, but instead we turn to something like this. And sorry, the next one's a big image, and so it takes a second to load. There it is. That maybe this imagines a world which is like this, which is a 12th century Venn diagram that says much the same thing in a way, that it's a picture of the world, a full globe here in the center, that's a TO map, rather than around the outside, but this too is calculating how the various forces of the world are held in balance together. So what I'd like to do, I mean, I have some other things we could talk about, but just jump as a spoiler alert to the conclusion and to think about then what this all means. And this may come across as slightly gnomic in its utterance, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of insight and hopefully a kind of sense of wonder and desire to know more and read the book. What I say is this: the musical aesthetics of medieval cosmologies is the cosmos listening to itself. And the articulation of this theory is an act of overhearing that seeks to capture, if only mimetically, if only as a kind of imitation, that self-reflexive experience. It bridges the gap between ontology and epistemology, between the way the world is made and the way we know that world, a gap that has been filled in different ways and to vastly different ends by calculating, projecting, analogizing, even just bootstrapping an aestheticized musica mundana, or world music, even if, or for the very reason that, the music can never be heard. For to really compose the cosmic harmony, to replace the analogical as with the literal is, would force the non-identical into identity. And as every good Pythagorean knows, there is no harmony in identity. So with that, a little bit longer than I should have, we'll open the floor to questions and to think more about this.